Hi everybody. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Allison. I just want to thank you all so much for coming out to listen to this talk. For a bit of background here, I learned about Hazel Knapp while doing research for a review of the Morris Herschel exhibition at the American Folk Art Museum, and her fascinating biography really just like totally stuck out to me. I was really astounded by the fact that there was no larger biography than what I found in kind of an obscure book for reference on her, more widely available. And rather than eating too much time going into that background, I'm just going to jump into the presentation. But I want to quickly give a huge thanks to let's call again Allison for everything that she did to help me with my research here, and Hazel's extended family for their generosity in supporting my research over the past almost 10 months. It's been a really immensely rewarding experience, and I've grown so much as a researcher and writer from that. So with that, we can get started and we'll jump right into her biography, which kind of begins at the end actually, which is kind of funny. But yeah, so on March 3rd, 1995, Hazel Victoria Knapp passed away in North Adams, Massachusetts. The scant three-sentence obituary, which you can see here on the left in her Vermont hometown newspaper, briefly outlines her death, the pastor who presided over it, and the location of the funeral service. This obituary almost makes it inconceivable that Knapp was an entirely self-taught artist featured in a well-known exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1938, was also the subject of a short biography in Sidney Janus's seminal book, They Taught Themselves, American Primitive Painters of the 20th Century, had a watercolor painting acquired by the Whitney Museum of American Art, and had multiple paintings purchased by Gertrude Stein, who later planned to have an exhibition for Knapp in France. Such accomplishments would normally form a foundation of modernist excellence that could easily lead to an established and well-regarded career in the arts. Why then, though, was there such a distinct absence of Knapp's fascinating life as an artist, not only in her obituary, but within art history more broadly? Knapp lived with Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, a rare hereditary condition that causes nerve problems and muscle deterioration. In Knapp's case, creating lifelong tremors and mobility issues, and she spent the entirety of her life largely dependent on her family, primarily her mother, for care. As a disabled woman living with a chronic illness in rural Vermont during the early 20th century, Knapp did not advocate for herself in the way that many other artists did to advance and preserve her career. In fact, the entire biography that I've compiled thus far on Knapp indicates how dependency was prevalent throughout her career and manifests in her artwork. Not one source of my research comes directly from Knapp aside from the artwork. Everything relies on external biographies, archival sources, and oral history interviews that I conducted with her nieces and nephews, as she never married or had children. My research seeks to resuscitate and venerate the history of a woman artist who was disabled, chronically ill, and dependent. By beginning to compile a biography of Knapp, integrating disability studies, and analyzing several of her extant artworks, it is clear that Knapp's identity as a disabled female artist wrongly positioned her outside of art history. In looking at Knapp's life and artwork through disability frameworks that embrace dependency, caretaking, and personal assistance within a feminist perspective, we can reject ableist trends in art history and our contemporary culture more broadly that do not support anomalies outside of normative standards. Hazel Knapp's art and life radically proves to us that forms of difference like dependency and disability are ways of being that universally impact us all and do not make anyone lesser, and in fact, can provide merit and beauty. But first, before going deeper into analysis, we'll look at her extraordinary biography and how this relates more broadly to the Southern Vermont Art Center's history. So Knapp was born in Arlington, Vermont on November 18th, 1908 to Arthur Hendrick Knapp, who worked various jobs and made money selling horses and buying land, and her mother, Elsie Mary Mitchell Knapp, who raised the children and kept up the house. Hazel had one older brother, Kenneth, one older sister, Gladys, and one younger brother, William. Her interest in art making began as a child, likely due to her illness restricting her mobility, where a local newspaper described her as using bits of paint found around the house to create work. Knapp used a wheelchair during the earlier part of her life, and her mother, Elsie Knapp, would work collaboratively with her by verbally describing aspects of the landscape that were unreachable by wheelchair while Knapp painted outside. One day, while Knapp was painting on the side of the road, the artist Harriet Miller stopped to look at her work, which began a relationship that would become a catalyst for Knapp's life and career as an artist. Miller was an American painter and sculptor from a wealthy family in Ohio and had years of art training in New York and Paris. with her work being in the collection of many prominent American art museums. After moving to Arlington, Vermont, Miller became very active in the local Vermont art scene and was a founding director of the Southern Vermont Artists Incorporated, which later became the Southern Vermont Art Center. Mrs. Miller also bought Knapp new oil paintings, canvases, and brushes, which were critical for her progression and were a vital resource for her blossoming career. Here on the slide, you can see Miller all the way at the top left. Through Miller, Knapp also participated in the Southern Vermont Arts Center summer exhibitions for 2 decades, which continue to this day. The first annual shows began in the 1920s with modest beginnings and happened in the last week of August through Labor Day, where work by local artists was acquired by prominent collectors and museums. By 1937, though, the exhibition saw over 6,000 visitors and generated over $15,000 in sales, around $300,000 today. Here, Knapp sold her work on multiple occasions alongside artists like Luigi Lucioni and Reginald Marsh, which led to acquisitions by the Whitney Museum of American Art and the Addison Gallery of American Art. However, it seems like her works have been de-accessioned or are missing from these collections. It can't be understated how paramount Knapp's connection to the Southern Vermont Art Center was, and it reflects the capacious nature of the annual exhibition and art center as a whole to support an artist with a disability like this. If you look at these pamphlets that were generously shared with me by the Bennington Art Museum, you can see Knapp's name on 2 checklists from 1938 and 1950, indicating her participation in the annual for over 2 decades and suggesting that she had such a prolific output. In the 1932 annual show, her paintings were sold to Alfred Harcourt, a regarded publisher of Gertrude Stein's books. During Stein's 1934 lecture tour of America, she saw Knapp's paintings in Harcourt's home and struck her interest. The Gertrude Stein archives held at the Beinecke Library had 2 letters that detailed the visit that Stein and Harcourt made to Harriet Miller's New York City apartment to see about 7 to 8 of Knapp's paintings, which Stein expressed delight over. Stein had purchased a significant quantity of Knapp's paintings, which hung in her home in France, where she planned an entire exhibition devoted to Knapp's work, once again underscoring the Southern Vermont Artists Center as an essential foundation for Knapp's career. Stein's connection to Knapp is also confirmed in Sidney Janis's 1942 publication, They Taught Themselves American Primitive Painters of the 20th Century, where he wrote a 3-page biography that recalls Stein purchasing multiple paintings by Knapp. Janis also writes that Stein planned to organize an exhibition for Knapp in her home in Europe, but this was unfortunately canceled due to the war. Multiple Vermont newspapers also confirmed that Stein had purchased numerous paintings by Knapp and planned this exhibition. An article from the Rutland Daily Herald the following year confirms that Stein's show for Hazel had to be called off due to World War II. I've not been able to find the exact communication from Stein to Vermont yet, nor the paintings themselves that she owned, but one of my next imperative goals of my research is to try and locate more evidence of these paintings and correspondence from Stein supporting this. Although the Stein show could have served as a watershed moment for Knapp, Sidney Janis also included her in a 1939 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, whose checklist you can see here on the left. Titled Unknown American Painters, Janis's presentation centered on self-taught artists it marked the debut of 2 other makers, Grandma Moses and Morris Hirschfield, who'd eventually become canonical in the field of American art history. Although the exhibition debuted these 2 artists who eventually gained prominence, it was not widely seen due to its placement in the members' lounge, which Newsweek described as the hush-hush show, and wrote that conflicted with the working class backgrounds of the artists who were a minister, a millionaire, and an invalid. The invalid is most likely a reference to Knapp, whose snow scene from 1939 was displayed and described by Janis as a crackling snow scene. While the moment show did not provide much traction for Knapp, a correspondence thanking Harriet Miller for shipping Knapp's paintings to MoMA, Janis outlines the potential for an exhibition of artists from the Southern Vermont area at MoMA. Although nothing ever came to fruition, it's clear that Miller once again acted as a major conduit in Knapp's life, and there was serious interest in Knapp's artwork from figures and institutions who shaped the history of modern art. It's also likely that that this led to Janis doing his 3-page biography on Knapp in They Taught Themselves American Primitive Painters of the 20th Century, which solidified Knapp as a contemporary of many other great self-taught American artists like Morris Hirschfield, Grandma Moses, John Kane, and Horace Pippin. Also of great significance, the following year in 1940, Harriet Miller sent Knapp to New York City, where she had an operation to help with her illness. While Knapp's exact movement and constraints before her procedure remained slightly vague, along with what the operation specifically did, both Janice and a local newspaper confirmed that Hazel's operation successfully improved her health and her mobility, although several family members have confirmed that she still had issues with movement throughout her life. Knapp continued to exhibit at the Southern Vermont Art Center until 1954, but Janice's 1942 publication seems to be the last major mention of the artist outside of the Vermont region. The rest of my growing biography on Knapp relies on local newspapers and oral histories conducted with her nieces and nephews, as she never had any children. In 1942, after 1942, there were significant events that altered Hazel Knapp's life. In 1946, Knapp's father died, which caused the family to move from their rural home in Arlington to a small house in Bennington, where her mother became both the primary caregiver and the wage earner for her family by working at a factory next door. You can see their Bennington home all the way to the right, which is obviously much smaller than her childhood home, which has been highly renovated from kind of like what her relatives told me were the more kind of like rustic, was the more rustic farm on the left. Nat's relatives describe her mother, Elsie, as a strong and caring woman who handled everything around the house, keeping the family's perfect lives in order and caretaking for Knapp, even giving her a set space to paint in their living room. On October 24th, 1957, though, Elsie Knapp passed away, and without her mother's aid, Knapp's well-being started to decline, and she slowly stopped taking care of herself, not cleaning and laying in countless stray cats. And kind of as her family has talked to me multiple times about, it just became, her home just started to become really uninhabitable. And as a result of this, she sadly stopped painting completely. And Knapp was eventually put into a nursing home in Massachusetts, where she passed away in 1995 at the age of 86. Hazel's biography makes it clear that her mother, Elsie Knapp, and Harriet Miller both served as critical caretakers in her life. This falls in line with typical gender dynamics where women operate in the role of maternal figures and are assigned the responsibility of watching over dependents. One of the greatest obstacles to being disabled is that in an able-bodied society, there's a typical view that being self-sufficient, self-reliant, and self-determining is the norm and only desirable state of being. However, the need for dependency due to impairment like Knapp's is obviously not inherently wrong. Is just socially constructed as such by an ableist world that condemns dependency. More broadly, the social model in disability studies argues that the impairments of an individual are not the problem. Rather, individuals are oppressed by a culture that acutely creates obstacles that could be fixed through reform. The aid that Knapp had received from her mother and Harriet Miller clearly provided an overwhelmingly positive influence on her life and helped her gain self-fulfillment through art. It is also evident that while it did not embody her worth, the medical treatment that she received clearly aided her. Knapp lived with self-determination through art and had her health needs taken care of for the first part of her life, showing us that living with dependency does not make anyone lesser. The other half of Knapp's life, though, does indicate how the pernicious structured forces that disavow disabled bodies in need of aid and the lack of full-time care after mother's death are the cause of Knapp's omission in art history, although her extended family certainly did do everything to take care of her well-being. It's interesting to think whether her legacy would have been better preserved had there been someone there to directly watch over her full-time for the entirety of her life. This is a condensed version of my analysis of Knapp's biography for disability studies, but I will show how this manifests across some of her paintings, along with giving some more context to the works I've been lucky enough to find and identify so far. Knapp's artwork expressed ideas of fulfilling a life through assistance and embodying appreciation of her own dependency. In looking at surviving works and archival records, I've identified 8 of Knapp's paintings that can be divided into large landscapes, portraits, and small watercolors. The first one on the left here, Guardians of the Valley from 1937, photographed in Sidney Janice's book, more abstractly shows 2 trees protecting the entrance to the valley. These guardian figures could easily be interpreted as Knapp's mother and father, especially since the work was done well before their deaths. The 2 paintings owned by her nephew on the right carry over similar mountainous landscapes. In both, Knapp places an imagined version of her home in a picturesque Vermont-inspired setting. As seen in the previous shot of her house in Bennington, these scenes were obviously not based on the home she was living in at the time. And according to her relatives, the three figures walking to the house in the central painting represents her brothers and her father. When looking at these paintings from a disability perspective, it symbolizes the dependency on a family unit. The three male workers whose labor is implied by the cut down trees behind them, walking back into the house that is lit by Knapp's mother, who serves as in the household caretaking role. The second scene, created in 1950, transplants a similarly snow-covered home into a winter lake scene with a mountainous background under a vibrant pink sky devoid of figures aside from the glowing yellow scene in the window. By placing the house within these imagined environments, Knapp intentionally commemorates and preserves the memory of the home she relied on for care, acknowledging our universal identity as interdependent human beings. Most likely done in her less rural Bennington home, these paintings' aesthetics indicate how much Knapp cherished Vermont's rural landscape as a part of her identity, especially her childhood home. The painting also departs from typical American landscape traditions that emphasize patriotism and love of country through the environment as metaphor. Knapp's self-taught vernacular utilizes her environment in a highly personal and specific manner to metaphorically represent her identity. While the present discourse surrounding disability did not exist in the early 20th century, as a disabled woman, Knapp's life and art are indicative of how many conversations in disability studies today. But rather than expressing bodily deviancy, the works render beautiful images of Vermont that aesthetically celebrate the value of dependence by associating the need for care with nature. The two works here that we found in the Southern Vermont Art Center's collection, Untitled Still Life of Roses and Untitled Portrait of a Man, serve more marketable functions in Knapp's production as works that were commissioned and sold to patrons. Untitled Portrait of a Man from 1950, seen on the left, is remarkable for its realism, which isn't entirely found in most of Knapp's works or imagined landscapes. While I've yet to identify the portrait subject, Knapp's family confirmed that she had previously been commissioned to paint other portraits, one of them being the Vermont governor Lee Emerson in the 1950s, which her nephew remembers Knapp painting from a photograph. The watercolor floral still life features a collection of red and pink roses that are highly expressive and delicate in their vibrancy. Watercolors seem to have been a central part of Knapp's output, as she sold two of them separately to the Whitney and the Addison Gallery of American Art. Although Knapp fell into obscurity and lived with direct personal aid for most of her life, she not only produced work that could be readily sold, but she was also directly commissioned by patrons for her talents. The third painting, owned by her nephew, Easter Twilight, depicts a horse that her brother Kenneth owned. The horse Easter Twilight was actually a locally renowned horse in New England, in the New England equine community, that won multiple awards and in the mid-20th century. Knapp's paintings depict the profile of the brown and white-footed horse in an early autumn scene where some of the birch trees have already begun to change into vibrant oranges and yellows with a mountainous backdrop again. Knapp most likely painted this from her memory in her Bennington home or possibly from a photograph. The painting is also highly commemorative, depicting the young, healthy colt, symbolically representing her family's well-being in the context of a Vermont backdrop. Although I've not been able to find this painting in real life, I did find it through the Beinecke Library at Yale University in Carl Van Vechten's archives. He took the photo in his lover, Mark Lutz's home. Although my research is still in progress, it once again indicates how Knapp's work traveled to other prominent figures and has surprising reach that obviously until now has really been largely overlooked. So my conclusions and next steps. There's still a lot to be done, and disability studies and medical sociology have been factoring heavily into my analysis, although I wasn't able to convey as much of that here, not to bog down this presentation too much, which mostly focuses on historical context and the artworks. But looking at disability studies through a feminist lens is very integral to my work, especially considering, as Rosemary Garland Thomas asserts, that femininity and disability are inexorably entangled within a patriarchal culture. To Garland, women in disabled bodies are inherently viewed as deviant, the opposite of the normate male body, it has been cast as such since Freud's alienating viewpoints on women, going back to Aristotle's belief that the female form is a flawed deviation from the male form. Pertaining more closely to Knapp in the 20th century, Susan Wendell writes that in contemporary culture, women are more likely than men to be disabled by chronic illness like arthritis, fibromyalgia, and MS, underscoring that accommodations for chronic illness like NAPS is essential in both feminism and disability politics. Additionally, my research here is more broadly looking at the construct of the self-taught outsider artist in art history as one that has a huge amount of parallels to the social construction of disability as figures cast out on the margins, especially considering that disability was a central driving force behind the careers of many American self-taught artists. Finally, there's still a lot of archival digging I have to do. My hope is that this presentation will allow me to more broadly connect with the Southern Vermont community and see if there is more information on NAP. And through this project, I really hope to make substantial contributions to the integration of disability studies into art history, which has historically excluded disabled bodies. And that's about it. So yeah, thank you so much for listening, everyone.
Thank you, Bryan. That was really wonderful, really rich, and thanks for sharing your goals, your aspirations for what's ahead. That sounds really, really exciting, and wishing you the best of luck. And certainly any way that SVC can help get the word out, we're happy to do so. And hopefully there'll be old members, artists who are still connected with the organization that might have a tidbit of information that could be useful to you. I think we wanted to open it up to questions, so people are welcome to unmute at this point and share any feedback, any comments for Bryan, any questions you might have, or you can also use the chat function. So we'll just give people a moment to collect their thoughts and see if there are any questions.
If there are none, no worries.
Bryan, how did you first come across Knapp? How did you find her?
Yeah, so I can go back. So yeah, if you look at the image on the right over here, I was doing research on the exhibition for Morris Hirschfield at the American Folk Art Museum. I was reading Sidney Janis's Unknown American Painters, They Taught Themselves, from the early 20th century. And in the book, he essentially like chronicles like a really like wide range of different American painters from the early 20th century who are all autodidacts. And as I was flipping through it, reading like these really rich and interesting, but very brief biographies, I stumbled upon Hazel's biography, and it just like really like blew me away. I was like so shocked that there was such like an interesting artist. We can even like look at what he wrote in the first page. Hazel Knapp, long an invalid, used to paint her landscapes from her wheelchair. If a bend in the road or tree obscured her view, her mother would go directly to the scene, and from this vantage point, sometimes the side of a mountain, report back to Hazel the details far beyond her field of vision. I mean, like, that is just such a compelling like image to have in your head, like the mother and the daughter like working collaboratively on a painting like that. And just like, I couldn't stop thinking about it kind of. So I ended up looking up Knapp within the southern Vermont region, and I found a couple of phone numbers on the internet, and I called her nephew, and they were shocked to find out that like what I was talking about, and they actually didn't believe me at first until I sent them all the materials about her, and then they were totally like surprised, and they're like, we do actually have some paintings by her. And I went up to go see them, and all of her signatures match. And then during that trip, I also visited the Southern Vermont Arts Center, where I met with Allison's colleague Anne, and they showed me everything at the Southern Vermont Arts Center. And I also emailed other institutions in the region, but unfortunately nobody else had anything by her. So I'm still doing more research to see if I could find more extant artworks. But yeah, it was a really delightful find and really fascinating, because there's like literally like, she's essentially like ungoogleable. Like at most, I think you'll find a record about her in MoMA, which is just something that like automatically happened because she participated in one of their exhibitions, but like it gives no context about like her life and work.
It's a really beautiful story and beautiful work. Were her nieces and nephews aware that Gertrude Stein had collected her work?
No.
Amazing. Like you're delivering all that news that she was in the MoMA and the Whitney. Really cool.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Yeah, no, and it's definitely, yeah, it's really interesting. It's gonna be like a really long time of seeing like what archival work I can kind of dig up. But yeah, it was a lot of really interesting discoveries.
Mom and Dad here, unabashed fans. Hi, Bryan. So we think it's wonderful that you've done all this digging and discovering, given her how few traces there are of her life. How hard was it to find info on her?
I was really difficult. Yeah, I mean, I had to look at like old. I mean, it was hard, but like luckily now there are what's it called again? There are a lot of online archives for newspapers, so like it wasn't as difficult as it probably was in the past, where I'd be like manually like looking through clippings, like the kind of like hardcore archival researchers of old kind of. So that was pretty nice to kind of have that more convenient route in terms of like piecing together and confirming certain aspects of her biography that Sydney Janis wrote about.
Yeah, I imagine that's the case. Looking forward to more info on her.
Yeah.
Hi, Brian. Jesse here. Really enjoyed the presentation. I really enjoyed the viewpoint you gave and all this. It was super cool to learn about. It also sounds like you started like doing all this like pretty ground up, like there wasn't a lot of previous research to work off of. Through this process, is it like highlighted like other cases of similar artists' work getting lost like over time due to like various reasons or not? Or do you find like Hazel's case to be pretty unique in that sense?
It must happen a lot. I mean, it's hard to quantify. I'm like not expert enough to quantify, but like if I like, for example, looking at the exhibition that she participated in at MoMA, there are like other artists there that like I think have like kind of like equally kind of fallen off the radar. They just don't necessarily pertain wholly to my research interest, but like I think there's a lot of like rich history there, and especially like thinking about the southern Vermont area as like having this like really fascinating like exhibition history in like the early 20th century, and like showing such like interesting artists like really really famous canonical like American figures alongside like these super regional, I mean they're all technically regional as like people who participate in this exhibition, but showing them alongside these like really regional figures, and like thinking about how like many prominent museums, collectors, and galleries would travel up to Vermont in the early 20th century to acquire these paintings is like kind of one example of what you're talking about, where like a lot of these people have probably fallen into obscurity, but there's probably like a lot of really amazing, rich research that can be done. And yeah.
Awesome. Thanks.
I'll just say related to that for anyone who might be in the Vermont area this summer, starting July 22nd, we have a big exhibition coming called For the Love of Vermont. And it's very much focused on the decade when Hazel Knapp was active, 1920s to 1960s. It's an art collection from a single collector, Lyman Orton, whose father founded the Vermont Country Store. Unfortunately, there's no Knapps in his collection, but to Bryan's point there, a huge range of artists from very well-known sort of successful artists such as Rockwell Kent to artists whose names are not kind of known really beyond the communities in which they worked. So interesting that this particular collector is bringing that all together. His goal is he calls it repatriating Vermont art. So he's gone out and found Vermont artwork that's made its way out to California, out to other places in the US, and is bringing it back to Vermont for Vermonters to enjoy, and for people who love Vermont to enjoy. So if there's a little bit of overlap, I think, with some of the subject matter, and particularly the history and time period that Hazel was working. So come to SVAC if you're in the area this summer.
Yeah, it's insanely beautiful. It's like such an amazing center. It was like such a privilege to like get to learn about it through an artist, and also like thinking about like Hazel's kind of like love of like the Vermont landscape, and thinking about how like the southern Vermont landscape has such like a distinct aesthetic that like it kind of was born out of it, is just like such a like fascinating thing to think about.
It's Bryan. Shall we leave it there then? To be
Yeah, for
continued?
sure.
Okay. Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining, and especially to Bryan for pulling together this fascinating presentation and giving us a teaser into his ongoing research. And again, wishing you the best of luck, Bryan.
Yep. Thank you so much, Allison. Thank you all for coming.
Good night.
Right, good night. Bye.